Hello again, and welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346, and today we're going to be talking about self-esteem. When we talk about self-esteem, we're basically talking about the evaluation of oneself, or the evaluation of one's self-concept. How do we feel about who we are? There are two types of self-esteem that exist. We can have trait self-esteem or state self-esteem. When we talk about trait self-esteem, we're talking about how do I generally feel about myself. And state self-esteem focuses on how do I currently, in this very moment, feel about myself. Additionally, we can have differences between explicit and implicit self-esteem, and each of these are measured in different ways. Explicit self-esteem are basically the feelings about ourselves that we can voice and that we're aware of. This is generally measured via self-esteem questionnaires, just simply asking us how we feel about ourselves. Other, more implicit forms of self-esteem are maybe how we truly feel about ourselves, and we may not actually be aware of how we truly feel about ourselves. There are a number of different ways in which we can measure implicit self-esteem. One is the lexical decision task. This is basically assessing how we associate ourselves with concepts of good or bad. Are we quicker to associate the word me with positive concepts than we are to associate the word me with negative concepts? Another way is through name, letter, and signature size. So individuals who like the letters in their own name more tend to have higher implicit self-esteem. So I would like the letters J and B if I had higher implicit self-esteem more than other letters. And individuals who have a bigger signature, a signature that takes up a larger portion of the piece of paper, tend to also have higher self-esteem. There are some issues with the different types of measurement. So for example, with explicit self-esteem, there could be self-presentational concerns. People may basically report that they like themselves a lot more than they actually do. Or maybe if someone wanted to be humble, someone didn't want to appear like a narcissist, they would basically report that they like themselves a lot less than they actually do. So what about self-esteem? We can have high self-esteem, we can have low self-esteem. Self-esteem is talked about a lot in mainstream media. A lot of people talk about how beneficial high self-esteem is. And there are some definite benefits to having high self-esteem compared to low self-esteem. More generally, there are some just differences in characteristics of people who are high and low self-esteem. We tend to see that high self-esteem individuals tend to be more approach-oriented, and low self-esteem more avoidance-oriented. So high self-esteem tend to move towards things, whereas low self-esteem tend to move away from things. High self-esteem tend to be promotion-focused, low self-esteem prevention-focused. So high self-esteem is focused on attaining goals rather than the low self-esteem individuals who are focused on basically making sure that bad things don't happen. And we also see that individuals with high self-esteem tend to have a clearer self-concept, whereas individuals with low self-esteem tend to be more confused about who they are as a person. So what are the benefits of high self-esteem? We hear that high self-esteem is good all the time. Well, having high self-esteem can help people buffer against negative outcomes. People can brush off failure a lot more easily. People can persist longer on difficult tasks. That can be turned against you if the task is actually impossible to complete. High self-esteem individuals tend to report a lot more positive affect than low self-esteem individuals. And low self-esteem individuals tend to have a lot of trouble with negative outcomes. We tend to see that individuals who are low in self-esteem tend to exhibit similar behaviors and reactions to negative outcomes as those who are depressed. Additionally, we see that individuals who have high self-esteem tend to have greater initiative. They tend to be more willing to try new things. They tend to be more confident in their decisions, in their behaviors, and in their beliefs. But is high self-esteem always a good thing? Is it the case where you should always strive to have high self-esteem? Well, first of all, it may be the case that high self-esteem isn't necessarily the cause of some of these beneficial outcomes, but that these beneficial outcomes are instead a cause of high self-esteem. So it could be the case that having high achievement can lead to self-esteem rather than vice versa. Additionally, there could be other extraneous variables that increase not only high self-esteem, but high achievement. We tend to see that a lot of people who are successful in life tend to have high self-esteem. For example, look at Donald Trump. He is not lacking for self-esteem, and all things considered, he is a pretty successful individual. But there could be other variables, such as encouraging parents, that not only lead to achievement, but can also help boost a child's self-esteem, and that can trickle on into adulthood. Additionally, there are some negatives to self-esteem, to having high self-esteem. Again, I talked about initiative. Well, this can backfire if people are performing extremely risky behaviors. These behaviors could lead to possible injuries and maybe even death. Individuals with high self-esteem tend to be less influenced by persuasion. Generally, this might be a good thing, but this can be bad even in certain situations where a person is making a really good argument, and a person should be persuaded given the information that's being presented to them. And lastly, self-esteem can get really intense and can lead to narcissism. Individuals who are narcissistic tend to have unrealistically high levels of self-esteem. They tend to be more physically and sexually aggressive towards others. They tend to be very manipulative. They tend to be unfaithful to their friends and romantic partners. And for the most part, they are unaware that they are narcissists. Hate to bring the guy up, but again, we can think about Donald Trump. He loves himself to an unrealistic point. And you can see a lot of these issues, a lot of these behaviors of narcissistic tendencies in what he says, does, and how he feels. So generally, we see that positive self-esteem, high self-esteem, is a good thing in moderate levels. We don't want to get an unrealistically high level of self-esteem. So how do we maintain self-esteem? Well, there are different ways that we can compare ourselves to others or relate to others that can help boost our levels of self-esteem. One such tool is social comparison. We can have both upward and downward social comparisons. When we have upward social comparisons, we're comparing ourselves to someone who is better off than us, and downward to someone who is worse off than us. Why would we use these? Well, we generally want to compare ourselves to someone who's better than us in order to motivate us to try and attain our goals. And we often compare ourselves to someone who's worse off than us to make ourselves feel better, especially if we're already in a bad mood. We can also use social reflection. This is basically, in certain situations, a form of social assimilation. So some of you are probably familiar with basking in reflective glory. Well, this is a way of assimilating yourself with a group or another person who has succeeded in one way, shape, or form. We reflect on ourselves, we kind of assimilate ourselves into the group, and we feel better as a result. We have to be careful though, because when that group, when the people who we're assimilating with start to perform negative behaviors, that's when we need to cut ourselves off from the group. This would be cutting off reflective failure. We can also use techniques through self-evaluation maintenance in order to maintain positive self-esteem. The different techniques that we use can differ depending on whether the domain that we're interested in is relevant to who we are as a person or is unimportant. We might reflect with others on an unimportant task, but we might compare ourselves to others on a relevant task. So if we see someone succeed in a task that we enjoy doing, we think we're good at, we might feel bad. But if we see someone succeed in a task that we don't really care that much about, we might assimilate with them and bask in their glory as well. So why is self-esteem important? Why is it so important that we maintain this self-esteem? Well, we talked about some of the positives that individuals with high self-esteem can achieve, but there are some additional theories that suggest that self-esteem is actually a very important thing to maintain. Terror management theory stresses that self-esteem protects us from anxiety that we might feel over our impending death. And sociometer theory suggests that self-esteem is basically a way of measuring how much we belong in other social groups. How much do we feel that we're connected meaningfully to other people? Additionally, we can have illusions of the self. So extremely high positive self-esteem could be one such illusion, but we can trick ourselves and think about the world in kind of nonsensical ways in order to help us feel better about ourselves. A lot of the times when we see well-adjusted people, they are well-versed in these positive illusions. They tend to use these pervasively, and they tend to use these quite frequently. So one example of a positive illusion or illusion of the self is having unrealistically positive self-judgments. We see this quite frequently in Western cultures where people think that they are above average on everything. They don't necessarily think that they are right in the middle. Obviously, statistically, it is impossible for everyone to think that they are above average. However, we tend to see that these people who do have these unrealistically high positive self-judgments tend to also live healthier lives. Additionally, we can see anthropomorphic illusions arise. This often occurs when people are lonely. They start to give humanistic qualities to non-human objects, such as volleyballs, for example, or pets to a certain extent, but other objects around the house can work too, having a pet rock, for example. This can often coincide in certain situations with belief in the supernatural, in certain beings that we can't necessarily see, feel, or actually interact with. Additionally, people generally have illusions of free will, the idea that we can choose to behave however we want and we're not just simply being influenced by others in the situation. As a social psychologist, it's difficult to suggest that we are completely in control of our behaviors. We've already talked about some of the influences that affect how we feel, how we think, how we behave without our knowledge. And this idea of free will can also influence superstitious behaviors. People perform these silly little trends like sitting in a specific couch or wearing a specific hat while watching a football game, thinking that they somehow have control over the actions that occur in the game. We can also have illusions of ability, and this is not necessarily illusion as much as it's an understanding of how ability works. So there are two different ways of understanding ability. Entity theorists have the idea that we have our kind of innate abilities and there's not a whole lot we can do to change that, to modify it. And incremental theorists believe that yes, we have innate abilities, these kind of baseline level abilities, but we can work hard to try and improve our abilities bit by bit. These different viewpoints of ability can lead to making different attributions of negative events, and it can lead to different behaviors in response to failure. For example, if I fail on a test, if I'm an entity theorist, I might think, oh well, there's nothing I can do, that's just who I am, I have to deal with it. Whereas an incremental theorist might think, oh okay, I didn't try hard enough, let's study a bit more for the next test and I'm sure I can be better. And lastly, we tend to see very frequently, especially within Western cultures, people having unrealistic levels of optimism. People generally tend to think that good things are going to happen to them and bad things only happen to other people. And this is consistent across quite a few behaviors. Unfortunately, this can lead to some risk-taking behaviors. So people might put themselves in situations that might lead to them getting injured or lead to death because they think, oh, bad things won't happen to me, they only happen to other people. We see this trend of unrealistically optimistic thinking hit its peak within adolescence. Okay, so that's all I have today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.